Welcome to an episode of Behind the Scenes, a weekly program unveiling the biggest political developments in Somali politics and the wider Horn of Africa region. I'm Sultan Mohammed, your host and producer here on HORUFADHI Media. On this week's program, Somaliland authorities declare a new offensive against SSC-Khaatumo forces as Sunday saw the heaviest fighting in the city for nearly a week. SSC-Khaatumo Council has also vowed to defend the city and will continue fighting until Somaliland forces withdraw from the region. This comes as traditional elders from southern Somalia visit the north to witness the violence and bloodshed. And all of this comes as the Hassan Sheikh Mohamud administration continues to remain absent from any attempts to seek dialogue in the conflict. This is the topic on the program today. We hope you find this program very informative. Please like, share, and for similar content, do subscribe to HORUFADHI Media. Also, do subscribe to HORUFADHI Media Group's second channel, known as HORUFADHI TV, where you are currently watching this program and where you can find other exclusive programs such as the Africa Weekly Roundup and Mahahi Salam, among others. And last but not least, do follow myself, Sultan Mohammed, Suleiman Hashi, Yasin Abdi, and the wider HORUFADHI Media team on our social media platforms that should appear on the screen in a moment. Let's get straight into the news. The conflict in Las Anod started because militants from Al-Shabaab embedded themselves within locals of Las Anod and launched an attack against Somaliland positions. Number 2, the Somaliland security forces in Sool had been attacked by forces outside the Somaliland region of Somalia, particularly from neighbouring Puntland state of Somalia, as well as the Haud region or Somaliland. Number 3, the conflict was orchestrated by the federal government in Mogadishu, initially during the presidency of Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo, but now under the presidency of Hassan Sheikh Mohamud. And number 4, the conflict in Sool is a, quote, civil war because the Bihi regime considers Somaliland separate from the rest of the Somali Republic, with borders stretching to one initially created by the oppressive colonial administration of the UK, which subjugated not just the locals of northern Somalia, but also the African continent. So in other words, the regime in Hargeisa conveyed that it was the victim of an attack all along, a complex attack from multiple fronts, and it simply was attempted to find a solution to the conflict. But the underlying issue was hijacked by militants disguised as local leaders. This was despite the overwhelming evidence that debunked these narratives. For instance, the fact that the separatist Somaliland authorities under the Bihi regime were killing protesters throughout the peaceful protests that took place in the city in December 2022 and January 2023, following the unjust killing of Abdul Fattah Abdullahi Hadrawi, the final assassination that eventually sparked the initial unrest. This assassination was one of more than 100 that have been ongoing in the city since 2009 that remain unsolved. And locals continued to blame the Somaliland authorities for the spike in the killings of high-ranking officials and members of society. And this is because, as I've said in this program many times, Somaliland was the authority in the city, and therefore they are accountable for the security and the protection of the citizens that live in the city. So therefore, if Somali citizens in Las Anod are feeling threatened or are being killed, then it is responsibility of the regional authority, which is Somaliland, to take that responsibility to identify and rectify these issues. And this hasn't been done, and therefore many have decided to blame Somaliland for these killings. Now, secondly, the fact that both Puntland State and the federal government of Somalia both denied involvement in the conflict in any way, and there has been no evidence for this so far. Well, of course, supporters of the Bihi regime, including the Bihi regime itself, have continuously argued and pointed to clan militia based in Las Anod. Currently, that's come from other parts of Somali territories. The thing is that these clan militia do not equate to government forces. These are locals from neighboring regions that might have clan relations to the clans that reside in Las Anod. For that reason, they are there. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the government of Ethiopia or the government of the of the rest of Somalia or the federal member state of Puntland send these forces. That's absolutely incorrect, and there has been no official evidence for this whatsoever. Number 3, Somaliland has consistently launched dawn attacks, breaking promises that it wanted a ceasefire. Now, the indiscriminate bombing has destroyed homes, schools, residential property, as well as public property. And finally, the simple fact that the Somaliland forces continue to refuse to withdraw from Sool, despite requests by the SSC-Khaatumo Council before any talks to initiate, in the region. And this just demonstrates that Somaliland has an intention, has goals here, and the goal is to capture Las Anod at any cost. Because if it was serious about peace, if it really wanted dialogue with the SSC-Khaatumo Council, it could simply withdraw its forces from the region for a temporary period of time and engage the leaders. There wouldn't be this bloodshed. There wouldn't be this conflict for nearly 2 months. There wouldn't be all this violence had Somaliland forces simply took a step back, took a breather, and let the politicians and traditional elders do their job and due diligence and find some practical political solution that prevents any bloodshed from being spilled. Now, the announcement of the offensive in Sool coincided with the visit of Somaliland leader Musa Bihi to the military headquarters in Hargeisa, where senior security officials briefed him on the last Anod conflict. Now, speaking to the press, the spokesman for the Somaliland military, Abdi Abdullah Hassan Abdullah, stated that Hargeisa had, and I quote, lost all patience after nearly 2 months of conflict, end quote. He went further to say that Somaliland forces, and I quote again, will begin an attack on SSC-Khaatumo forces in Sool, end quote. Now, the announcement came as Somaliland launched an unsuccessful attack against SSC-Khaatumo positions on the morning of Sunday, in which the city saw its heaviest fighting over the past week. There are currently reports that Somaliland forces are preparing its units on multiple fronts on the western and eastern sides that are important fronts for both forces. Now, both sides blamed the other for the attack on Sunday, with the SSC-Khaatumo Council stating that Hargeisa launched the dawn attack on Sunday in a bid to derail the planned visits of clan elders from southern Somalia, including the clans of Hawiye and Rahawain. But why does Somaliland want to derail the meetings? The mediation of clan elders from other regions from Somalia is beneficial to the SSC-Khaatumo Council because it demonstrates that this conflict is between Somalis within the borders of the Somali Republic, rather than one centralized to a separatist Somaliland region. Ultimately, this weakens the argument pushed by the separatist Somaliland regime that Somaliland region is separate from the rest of the Somali Republic, as it shows contrary by the visit of these traditional elders. Additionally, President Musa Bihi has already pushed a narrative that the conflict in Sool is one that is underlined by clan tensions exclusive to the Somaliland region. However, the presence of clan elders from the south demonstrates that this conflict is far beyond a simple clan conflict. And the best example I can provide is if we look at the conflict that took place in El Afwain a few years ago between clans in the region. It was traditional elders that mediated and ended the conflict rather than Somalia military launching an all-out war in Senag. It is clear this conflict is one that's underlining by political issues, more specifically the issue of separatism versus unionism. So what does Somaliland under Bihi have to gain by invading or attacking Las Anod again? Ultimately, the Somaliland regime wants to recapture the large swathes of land it lost to the SSC-Khaatumo Council, which overran the city of Las Anod, including most of its surrounding territory. If victory were achieved for the Bihi regime, it would attempt to find local support to push its narrative and oppress any opposition to its rule, as it has done so for the past decade, and enforce a separatist agenda rather than one of a unionist. However, if Somaliland were to fail in its objective to capture Las Anod and Sool, it would be forced to withdraw from Goja Adde. Ultimately, any further withdrawal for Somaliland will ultimately result in the Bihi regime being left with no choice but to completely withdraw from Sool, ending any claim it had to the region, as it failed both politically and militarily to capture the town. Right now, we know the Bihi regime has politically failed because it attempted to send so-called traditional elders to no avail. It engaged in talks with Ethiopia in which it broke those promises and launched an offensive on Sunday. It pledged ceasefires and broke those ceasefires. So politically, Somaliland seems to have failed to engage these elders because the elders in SSC-Khaatumo simply want these forces to withdraw from Sool before any talks, and for Somaliland, that is non-negotiable. Therefore, politically, there's an impasse that cannot be resolved. So the only solution for Somaliland is a military one. And if the military solution fails, if Somaliland fails to capture Las Anod as it plans to do so and declared on Sunday, then surely there is no other alternative for the Bihi regime but to withdraw, quite embarrassingly, from the region. So, what has the SSC-Khaatumo Council said about recent developments? Now, the council spokesman Aqil Abdurrazzaq Mohammed Hassan Falaluk stated that Somaliland would not likely launch an attack greater than its offensive on Sunday. Speaking to Galen Media, the commander of the SSC-Khaatumo Forces, General Saeed Shode, stated that calls by the Bihi regime for a ceasefire and dialogue was an attempt to deceive the world and mislead the international community. He went on further to say his forces are ready to fend off any Somaliland attack and that his forces will be ready for a ceasefire only and once only all Somaliland forces withdraw from the Sool region. Now, indeed, Somaliland has been launching attacks on the city since the conflict began, and it's not something new to see or hear another offensive being launched. The reality is that Somaliland has been in preparation for this attack for weeks now, despite the Bihi government stating that he was ready for talks only last week. The declaration of war removed the thin cloth that the separatist Somaliland authorities attempted to use to cover their covert attempts to militarily quash any local resistance to its separatist agenda in Sool. So, what about the Addis Ababa talks that we've been hearing about in recent weeks? Well, the talks seem to have collapsed because Somaliland declares an offensive. In other words, the decision by Bihi has put the final nail in the coffin for any possible talks between the two sides for the foreseeable future. While Hargeisa did not provide large amounts of detail regarding the talks it had with the Ethiopian delegation and possible talks in Addis Ababa, the SSC-Khaatumo Council made it clear as to why the talks are stalling from their end. Speaking to the press, Gilad Abdulsalam Hassan Mohammed stated that the leadership was grateful to Ethiopia, that it wants to resolve this conflict. However, he highlights that the environment is not right with constant artillery bombardments and roadblocks. It seems as though the council was not wrong because the separatist Somaliland forces are now ready for another offensive as they claimed on Sunday. Now, to begin an offensive, there are a series of objectives, military objectives that must be completed before such a launch, including, number 1, the softening of defenses via artillery and aerial bombardments, number 2, encirclement and cutting off of supplies of the enemy, and number 3, continuous raids to keep opposing forces on edge. Now, all of the above actions have been taken by Somaliland. We know they've tried to cut off electricity supply, water supply, they've blocked roads and access to the city. They are attempting to besiege the city. And in recent weeks, they have done so, despite the major setbacks on all these objectives. Of course, Somaliland has not successfully achieved any of these objectives, but it's attempting to, and that signals its intention. And finally, where is the federal government? And I think every single week on this program, we discuss this question. Why is the federal government remaining quiet about the conflict in Las Al Nord, aside from its outlining a neutral position that both sides need to engage in dialogue? Why doesn't the federal government facilitate this dialogue? Why doesn't the federal government engage both sides and attempt to find a compromise? Because ultimately, it is the job of the federal government, as I've repeated on this program, time and time again, to find a solution to this conflict. It's the constitutional duty of President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud to keep the unity of this country. It's non-negotiable. Ultimately, it has not actively attempted to intervene or provide a solution on both sides, and the conflict continues to rage on. When will President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud and his government take responsibility and play a leading role in finding a peaceful solution to this waging on conflict? When will President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud and his government take responsibility and play a leading role in finding the solution to this conflict? Now, the active role that was taken by Ethiopia in an attempt to mediate internal Somali issues demonstrates the humongous failure of this administration to keep the peace and unity in Somalia.